Welcome, everyone. It's great to have people getting together to talk about net metering in Wyoming. I'm Scott Kane. I'm with a solar contractor in Wyoming, Creative Energies, and I've been asked to organize or to moderate today's webinar. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. This meeting is being hosted by a coalition of conservation organizations, solar businesses, homeowners, Wyoming businesses, and local governments. The motivation for the study that we're going to be hearing about today is that for more than 10 years, there have been discussions in Wyoming, including at the legislative level, about net metering. Frequently, a central topic in these discussions has been the financial impacts that might be borne by other non-solar utility customers. This study was funded by a group of Wyoming conservation groups on behalf of their members who have asked for a clearer depiction of how distributed solar impacts the utility markets, specifically in Wyoming. Crossborder Energy was selected to conduct this study based on their depth of experience conducting studies in settings similar to Wyoming's. Crossborder Energy has worked on net energy metering issues, including having conducted studies in Idaho, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, California, Arkansas, and both Carolinas, and now in Wyoming. Tom Beach will be presenting to us, representing the work that Crossborder Energy has performed. Tom, in addition to participating in studies in the states that I had mentioned, has also participated as a staff member of the California Public Utilities Commission and has had a private consulting practice in this area since 1989. In addition to work on solar and net metering issues, Crossborder Energy has also worked actively on electric rate design and electric vehicle issues in multiple states. It is our hope that it's the hope of those who commissioned the study that the findings are highly specific to Wyoming in terms of its utility providers, its generation transmission infrastructure, its load profiles and rate structures. We hope that the summary might provide information relevant to the important questions being asked in our state. We'll start off next with having Tom Beach from Crossborder Energy give a presentation that may last 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, and preserve the time after that for the remainder of the hour for question and answer time. We have turned off the chat function on this Zoom call, but enabled the Q&A, the question and answer field. If you look in the sort of lower border of your window, you'll see a Q&A tab. If you open that, you'll see a Q&A window in which you'll see any questions that other participants have asked, and you yourself are welcome to add questions as well. Please feel free to present questions to to submit questions to the presenter in that box, and please also add your own name and, if it's relevant, your position in the state to your question. That may help to give context for the question that you're asking. We'll, for the most part, save those questions until after the presentation, and we hope for a robust Q&A at that point. So with that, I will turn this role over to Tom Beach of Crossborder Energy to present the findings of the study.
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending this webinar. We were commissioned to do a benefit cost study of net energy metering in Wyoming. And as Scott mentioned, we've done similar studies in numerous other Western states, and are happy to have extended our work in this area to Wyoming. I want to emphasize at the outset that every state is different, although the basic framework that we use to do these studies is the same from state to state. Each state has a different mix of resources, different costs, different benefits for solar, different solar resources. And so really, this is one of those issues where everything is local. And so you need to take a close look at each individual state. So our study, we looked at the benefits and costs of net metered solar in Wyoming, which is the predominant distributed generation resource. There's about 10 megawatts of solar distributed generation DG online today, growing at about 3 megawatts a year. And we looked primarily at the service territory of Rocky Mountain Power as the state's largest investor-owned utility, mainly because the data, public data on the benefits of solar were most thoroughly available for Rocky Mountain Power. We did also look on the cost side at some of the costs of net metering for 2 rural co-ops, High Plains Power and Carbon Power and Light. And so I'll discuss those findings later on. So maybe now we can take a look at the first slide. I have a small number of slides to kind of illustrate our presentation. So the method we use to do this study is really the same methodology that's used all across the US in looking at the costs and benefits of other types of demand side utility programs like energy efficiency, demand response, those kinds of programs. This is a very well established set of benefit cost tests that's used throughout the US. And there's some important characteristics of this benefit cost analysis. First is we look at multiple perspectives. We don't just look at a single perspective. There are a bunch of different stakeholders in distributed generation. There's the customers who install solar. There are other ratepayers who do not have solar. And then there's the perspective of kind of the utility system and society as a whole. And so you need to look at all 3 of these perspectives when you do a benefit cost study. So we actually looked at 4 different tests in conducting the study, and they're summarized on this graphic here. And the pluses means a benefit, the minuses mean a cost. And if you look at the categories here, the first test is the total resource cost test. That's the one that looks at the benefit to the system as a whole. And the benefits in this test are the cost that the utility avoids, the avoided costs from customers putting solar on their homes and serving a portion of their energy use with their own generation. And then that's the benefit in the total resource cost test. The costs are the cost of customers actually installing this resource, primarily the capital and O&M costs of the resource, plus any incentive costs and program administration costs. So that's the first test. The second test, the ratepayer impact measure test, is the test that measures the impact on non-participating ratepayers who don't install solar. The benefits in this test, again, are the avoided costs for the utility, because the utility is saving money from customers producing their own power. The costs in this test are the revenues that the utility loses from customers using their own electricity on their own premises instead of buying it from the utility. I'm going to skip over the program administrator test, which is not really a major test that's of interest. The final test is the participant test, and that's looking at the perspective of the customer who actually installs solar. And in the participant test, the benefit to the customer is the bill savings, the lower utility bill that the customer has. And that's actually the benefit in the participant test is the cost in the RIM test. You can see the second line there. And then if there are any incentives, that's obviously a benefit for the participant. And the cost for the participant is the cost to buy the system, the capital and O&M costs of the resource. So those are the tests, the three principal tests that we look at in these studies, so that we get a sense of solar DG from all the perspectives of all the different stakeholders. So in conducting the study, if you read it, you'll see that most of the pages are spent looking at the avoided costs to the utility. Another really important characteristic of these studies is we try to look at a very comprehensive list of avoided costs. There's the avoided energy that the utility doesn't have to produce. There's avoided generation capacity that the utility doesn't have to build. And there also can be avoided transmission and distribution costs from expansions to the grid that can be saved. There's also fewer losses in the transmission and distribution wires because the power is produced right at the customer's premises. A large fraction of the power never touches the grid, and so it saves on line losses. There also are can be benefits in environmental compliance costs, and it also reduces the amount of typically natural gas that the utility has to purchase. Natural gas prices, as we know today, can be extremely volatile. We're going through one of those moments as we speak. And so there is a benefit from reducing fuel price volatility, and also a benefit because renewable generation, because it has zero marginal cost, it reduces prices in the energy market, and that's also a benefit. And finally, there can be some societal benefits. These are not benefits that show up on your utility bill, but can be benefits, for example, environmental benefits to society as a whole. So in going through, a lot of the work in the study is going through each of these avoided cost categories and describing how we calculated them. Why don't we move to the next slide, which kind of provides a summary of the avoided costs of a solar DG installation in Wyoming. And this is principally using data from Rocky Mountain Power. The energy benefit is based on energy market prices in Wyoming. And I guess the other thing that is important to point out is that these are 25-year levelized numbers. So maybe the third and final key characteristic of these studies, in addition to multiple perspectives, a comprehensive list of avoided costs. And the final one is we are using a long-term perspective here. A solar installation will produce power on your house for 25 years. That's what they're warranted for. And so it's important to use a long-term perspective in calculating these avoided costs. So the energy benefit is based on energy market prices in Wyoming today, at the times when solar produces. And then we escalate those prices out into the future using a long-term forecast that was in Rocky Mountain Power's most recent integrated resource plan. It's about 5 cents a kilowatt hour, or $51 a megawatt hour. Generation capacity, solar does produce power, especially on summer afternoons, which can be a critical time for having adequate generation capacity. And this is based on the 2 cents per kilowatt hour here is based on energy storage costs. Storage is one of the key capacity resources that utilities in the West are building these days. And we took a lot of the storage cost data from Rocky Mountain Power's IRP as well. And we also used a 14% contribution from solar to reducing RMP's capacity costs. The third category of avoided cost there is losses, because solar reduces line losses. That's about a penny. Rocky Mountain Power is actively planning to reduce its carbon emissions in the future, phasing out its coal-fired generation over the next several decades and building a lot more renewables. Its IRP includes an assumed carbon compliance cost, and we use that cost to value the reduced carbon emissions that result from this renewable generation. Again, that's about a penny. We also looked at avoided transmission and distribution capacity costs. If you look at the utilities investment data over a long period of time, you'll see that their investments in their T&D system increase as their load grows. Not surprising. And we do an analysis of changes in transmission and distribution costs as a function of the peak demand that the utility serves. And this is kind of a standard approach used in the utility industry to calculating marginal or avoided transmission and distribution costs. And we also look at the contribution of solar to reducing peak demand in the hours when demand peaks on the T&D system. And we get about 2.5 cents of avoided T&D capacity costs. And then the final two avoided cost categories are mitigating market prices and reducing the uncertainty in fuel prices. In other words, mitigating the volatility that we're seeing today in the natural gas market. That volatility has a price. Customers feel it whenever we see a spike in energy prices, such as we're experiencing it today. And we have developed a methodology that was pioneered by the Maine Public Utilities Commission for quantifying the benefit of renewables, which of course have no fuel costs, to producing a utility system that's less vulnerable to fuel price uncertainty. And that turns out to be a pretty significant avoided cost because it's over 25 years. Some utilities have hedging programs that hedge their fuel prices for 1 or 2 years out in the future, but it's pretty expensive to hedge for 25 years. And that's why this is a fairly significant benefit. And the final benefit there is that when you add renewables to your system, they have zero marginal cost, and they end up reducing market prices on the system by shifting the supply curve, and that's a relatively small benefit. So putting that all together, the avoided cost benefits are about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, why don't we at this point go to the next slide, and this is where we put everything together. I'll comment first on a couple of the cost categories. In the participant test, the cost there is the cost of customers installing solar. That's also the cost in the total resource cost test, the brown bar there. That's based on a solar cost of $2.75 per watt. We translate that into a cost of about 12.5 cents over 25 years. Then the other important category here are the customer bill savings. Now, the customer bill savings, as I said before, are the benefit in the participant test, and they're the cost in the rim test. You can see that yellow bar there is the same in those two tests, but it's a benefit to participants from savings on your bill, but that's the cost to other non-participating ratepayers, because those are the revenues that the utility is losing. And what we did for that, it's about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. We looked at how much customer bill savings would be in Rocky Mountain Power service territory from a typical solar installation. We also looked at the two rural electric co-ops as well. And the benefits, the bill savings ranged from about about 9 cents a kilowatt hour on Rocky Mountain Power system up to about 12 cents in one of the co-ops. And so that 10 cents is kind of the middle of that range. So now putting all this together, you can see that the benefits exceed the cost in the rim test and the total resource cost test. So our benefits, our avoided costs of about 14.5 cents exceed in the total resource cost test, exceed the 12.5 cents it costs to actually install solar DG. And that means that solar DG is a cost-effective resource for the system as a whole. And in other words, it's a cost-effective generation addition in Wyoming. Then in the rim test, the fact that the benefits exceed the costs means that there is no cost shift to non-participating ratepayers. And that's really, the rim test is really a measure of equity. And sometimes it's called the no losers test, because if a resource passes the rim test, then everybody should benefit if the resource is installed. Now, the one test that it doesn't pass is the participant test. And here you can see that the cost, 12.5 cents, are somewhat higher than the bill savings of about 10 cents. And that's probably not surprising. Wyoming has pretty low electric rates, and the solar penetration of solar DG in Wyoming is relatively low, and that's probably because the costs are somewhat higher than the available bill savings. Wyoming doesn't have any state incentives for distributed solar, such as some other states have. So I think the fact that solar distributed generation doesn't pass the participant test kind of explains why the uptake in Wyoming has been relatively low thus far. And so that's basically, where our study came out on the three principal cost benefit tests. I would like to spend just a couple minutes at the end of my presentation here talking about the last set of bars there, the societal test. So the societal test is the same as the total resource cost test, except that we've added some societal benefits, which is the green bar there. And we quantified quite quite a list of societal benefits. We quantified the reduced damages from climate change. We quantified air quality benefits. We quantified local economic benefits. We looked at water, land use, and so we looked at quite a few different societal benefits that can be quantified. The three ones that were most important were reduced damages due to climate change, and that includes reductions in leakage of methane from the natural gas system. When you install renewables, you're going to be burning less natural gas, and less methane will leak from the gas pipelines. And as you all may know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So that was probably about a third of those societal benefits. There were significant societal benefits from reductions in criteria air pollution, NOx, SOx, and particulates. We used some EPA models to quantify the health benefits of cleaner air. That was also a significant societal benefit. And then finally, we looked at local economic benefits. And you know, when solar is installed, fairly significant part of the cost, about a quarter of the costs, are spent in the local community. Obviously, the solar panels themselves and the inverters probably are manufactured somewhere else, but there are significant costs for installation labor, marketing, for the basic the offices of the solar installer companies. So there's about a quarter of the costs are spent in the local community and produce local economic benefits. So that was another important component of those societal benefits. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that people have about the study.
Wonderful, Tom. Thank you very much for giving an overview, and I hope that in the context of answering a few questions, we may find parts of this report to go into in a little more detail. I'll start us off with one question submitted by Lander resident Greg Finley. He asked, what percentage of penetration does that 10 megawatts of Wyoming distributed generation represent?
It's pretty low, and it's well below 1%. And I know that Rocky Mountain Power's IRP has some projections of the growth of distributed generation for the next 20 years. And those projections show that penetration is not going to reach 5% in Wyoming until after 2030, I think, even in the most optimistic scenario. So that's, if you look at other states that have significantly higher penetration of rooftop solar, obviously Hawaii is by far the leader. They're over 20% penetration. California is at about 10%. And I think Arizona is probably between 5 and 10%. If you look at those states that have significantly changed their net metering policies, most of them don't embark upon changes to net metering until they hit about 5% penetration. That's when California first made a significant change in its policies was when it hit about 5%, and kind of same for Arizona as well, and Nevada. So most states, that's been the experience, is the kind of the full retail net metering has tended to stay in place until the penetration hits about 5%.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's helpful. And thank you, everyone in attendance. I can see that there's quite a few questions popping up on the Q&A list. That's great. We will see if we can get through most of these. Next one is specific to one of the graphics that Tom displayed, and that was Lisa Young of the Sierra Club in Idaho asked, why is the brown bar higher in the last column compared to the second to last column? Shouldn't they be the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's because in the societal test, you do not count federal tax incentives. So the brown bar is basically the cost of solar. And in the societal cost test, that you do not include the federal investment tax credit that reduces solar costs by 26% this year and 22% next year. So I believe that's the reason. That's a great question.
Great. And here's one that's here's one that's a sort of a broader topic, maybe a little bit beyond the scope of of your presentation. And this came from Robert Meredith. What about large scale? What about large utility scale solar or wind? In theory, doesn't this have the same benefit, but is at a fraction of the cost?
Sure, that's a good question. There's some differences between utility scale solar and rooftop solar. So they don't have exactly the same benefits. Rooftop solar is installed on customers' homes, on their premises, right where the power is used. And so, typically half, sometimes more of the electricity is immediately consumed by the homeowner and never touches the grid. The other 50% that's exported to the grid is pretty much immediately consumed by the customer's neighbors and effectively only travels a short distance on the grid. So, and it basically reduces loads upstream on the grid and gives the grid more capacity. So those avoided T&D costs are a benefit of rooftop solar that utility scale doesn't produce. Utility scale facilities, of course, have to be located where there's large amounts of available land. Those tend to be remote from the load centers. So in some cases, in many cases, you actually have to expand the transmission system to get that power to the customer. So that's a significant difference between rooftop and utility scale. In addition, rooftop solar has additional benefits for the customer. You can add storage to your rooftop solar system, as people around the country increasingly are doing. And when you do that, you of course gain an assured backup supply of electricity that can power your home when the grid goes down due to storms or for whatever reason. And that is in the world we live in today with more climactic extreme weather. That's of increasing importance to customers. So, and rooftop solar, of course, provides a way to refill your batteries if you have an extended outage. So that's significant benefit of distributed solar to customers as well. And then there's, I think people like, they like the freedom that producing and consuming your own power on your own premises using your own capital gives them. I think there's an element of competition and customer choice and enhancing the freedom of your energy supply that appeals to customers about rooftop solar that is not there with a utility scale installation that is then distributed by the monopoly utility.
Thank you. That's great. I'll keep a couple more questions coming. Kara Cochette asks, following up on the system benefits that were expressed in cents per kilowatt hour, how does that compare to what a utility pays a rooftop solar user in terms of kilowatt hours? I think this is perhaps a question specifically to the net metering arrangement in Wyoming.
Sure. So what the utility pays the customer is basically the utility allows the customer to, in essence, run their meter backwards. And so the customer obviously reduces what they take from the utility by the power that they produce and consume on site. And then during those hours where the customer has excess power that they export to the grid, that basically just runs the meter backwards. And so you get a credit for that power at effectively the retail rate. And so the cost to the utility is basically the volumetric retail rate times the amount of solar that's produced. And then the benefit is the avoided cost, which are the costs that the utility doesn't have to spend because customers are producing their own electricity. And that's the 14.5 cents per kilowatt hour.
Great, thank you. Penny Vance asks, do you have an estimate of how long it would take for Wyoming at the existing rate of penetration, or perhaps the rate of additional new distributed generation capacity, to reach that 5% penetration? Is it a given that once we reach that level, that we will have an inequity ratepayer issue because of solar customers and non-solar customers?
Well, like I said, the Rocky Mountain Power's IRP did some projections of penetration. And like I said, even in the high case, I don't think Wyoming hit 5% until about 2030. I think in the base case, it was more like 2035. And I don't want to necessarily prejudge what the economics of rooftop solar will be in 2030 or 2035 when, if that's when you hit 5% is. I mean, I guess this study, I think the results were pretty clear cut that there is not an issue with cost shifts today at the level of penetration in Wyoming. But when you hit 5%, that is a good time to kind of do another assessment. And the economics can change over time, and it's a little hard to look out 10 years from now and know exactly what the world's going to look like in that time frame. But like I said, in most other states that have high penetrations of rooftop solar have kind of re-examined the program at about the time when they hit the 5% penetration.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe I'll take this opportunity to take advantage of my position here and ask my own question rather than reading off the list if I could. I'd love to hear, Tom, from your work within Wyoming. You know, your study addressed Rocky Mountain Power, a large regional investor-owned utility, and it examined High Plains Power and Carbon Power and Light, two regional, relatively small rural electric co-ops. Did you see a significant difference in terms of the economic involved in distributed generation solar for these two very different classes of utility? And might this question about penetration perhaps be different for a small regional utility versus a large multi-state utility?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think that a lot of the let's first look at the benefit side, looking at the RIM test and the avoided cost side. You know, I think a lot of the benefits are probably similar for the smaller utilities and as they are for Rocky Mountain Power. For example, you know, we used electric market prices in Wyoming for the avoided energy costs that are about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And those, you know, electricity market prices are fairly similar across the state. You know, there's small variations, but the electric market prices are pretty similar. You know, the generation capacity, avoided cost, yeah, some utilities may be in a different capacity situation than Rocky Mountain Power, which is pretty actively adding new resources, especially renewables. Other utilities may not be doing that, so that could be a component that's different. The line loss component is going to be similar. The avoided transmission costs, you know, all of the utilities in the state use the high voltage transmission system. You know, we obviously were looking at Rocky Mountain Power's transmission system costs, you know, specifically, but I think they're pretty representative of the cost of transmission in Wyoming. Distribution costs could be an area where there's a difference between a utility like Rocky Mountain Power and a rural electric co-op that has a much smaller system. So I guess I would say that there are some of the avoided costs that could be different, but I think many of them are going to be pretty similar, especially the more kind of system type benefits for energy and transmission. I think the avoided costs will be similar for the rural co-ops and Rocky Mountain Power. Now, obviously, the rural co-ops they may take wholesale service from a wholesale co-op like Tri-State or Basin Electric, but you know, those wholesale co-ops operate, you know, in the same market and use the same WECC grid as Rocky Mountain Power. So there can be some differences, but I think generally the avoided costs here are probably broadly applicable to all the utilities in Wyoming.
Great, thank you. I'll ask the next question because it's closely related to what you were talking to. Robert Meredith asked, can you please explain how avoided transmission and distribution T&D costs were determined?
Sure. So there are two components to doing avoided T&D. The first step is to calculate the utility's marginal cost of transmission, and what we look at there is for Rocky Mountain Power, we looked at 25 years of investment data in their transmission system. In other words, how much money did they put into their transmission system every year? And we also looked at their load growth over that 25-year period, and we did a regression. And it turns out that their transmission investments are pretty strongly correlated to their load growth. Not surprising, as their load grows, they have to build more transmission to serve it. And so that gives us a marginal cost of transmission. And then we looked at, well, what is the effect of distributed solar on the utilities peak demand? And we looked at you look at what the production profile from distributed solar is. And then you look at the utilities load profile, and you look at when are the peak days and the peak hours, and what is solar producing on those peak days and peak hours. There also are even more sophisticated analyses of that solar contribution using what's called an effective load carrying capacity analysis. And I think for transmission, we came up with an 18% solar contribution. So that means that 10 kilowatts of solar would reduce the utilities peak demand by 1.8 kilowatts. And so you multiply that 18% by the marginal cost of transmission, and that gives you your avoided cost of transmission due to solar distributed generation. And we did the same analysis on the distribution side as well, and it's discussed at length in the report. And there you can see the regressions that we did of looking at T&D investment dollars versus load growth, for example. So it's laid out there in the report.
That's great. Thanks for the thorough answer on that. And I'll point out as well, for those of you who have not actually reviewed the report itself directly, it has just been released, and in this webinar, we are sharing a link to where you can access it. But the report is quite in-depth, and you'll see essentially all assertions that Tom is making verbally here, and which were made in the couple of graphs he displayed. Almost every single thing is supported by some kind of a additional supporting table or additional supporting reference. That the T&D cost in particular was one that the report addresses in good detail. Adam Keifenheim asks, what alterations to net metering have other states implemented that have been successful at reducing cost shift or perceived cost shift, but also have not discouraged distributed generation solar development?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what the first step that California took when it hit the 5% penetration level was to require solar customers to go on a time of use rate. And as many of you probably know, the costs of producing and delivering electricity varies significantly throughout the day. If you have a summer peaking system, it tends to be low at night and in the morning, and then the demand rises in the afternoon, tends to peak in the late afternoon, and the cost of electricity at the peak can be a lot higher than what it is during the off-peak hours at night or in the morning. And so, California in 2014 required all solar customers to go on to time of use rates, and that time of use rates more accurately price the consumption of electricity, and so that's a kind of California took that step, and basically it did not have a significant, it did, let me put it this way, it did not have a significant adverse impact on the residential solar market in California. I think the commercial solar market in California did slow down after after California went to time of use rates that had a peak from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. kind of in the evening. That evening peak did slow down the solar market, the commercial solar market in California. But the residential market in California was able to accommodate that significant change in rates without a significant difficulty. And Hawaii did something similar. They significantly reduced the rate that solar customers receive for power that's exported to the grid in the middle of the day when they have a lot of solar available. So those kind of rate design changes are examples of what states have done that have been successful at mitigating some of the cost shift concerns without hurting the market.
Thank you. There was a question specifically about I'll put it in my own words, but about essentially looking at what is going on currently in California. This came from Ed Council. Currently in California, with its current revision of its net metering rules, and he asked what might be learned, or what concerns might we have with the approach that the California PSC, Public Service Commission, has taken with imposing new fees on net metered customers.
Yeah, well, that's a that's a very timely and kind of controversial topic. I think that what the California PUC is discovering, that the fees that they have been proposing, and nothing has been, first of all, nothing's been adopted here in California yet. It's still a very vigorous debate going on. I think one of the two things about the fees that have been proposed that have really kind of rubbed solar customers the wrong way are number one, having fixed charges that customers can't do anything about. I think that is, customers want to be able to impact their energy costs, and imposing fixed charges doesn't allow them to do that. It really only incents them to leave the system. And that's maybe not something that's easy to do today, but if solar and battery costs continue to decline in the future, it's going to present more and more a viable option. And I'm sure there are actually probably quite a few off the grid solar and battery customers in Wyoming who may be located too far from a utility line to take service, and who use batteries and solar today. And as the costs come down, that's going to become more and more of a viable opportunity, and imposing large fixed charges for taking utility service would just accelerate that trend. So that's one thing that I think is caused a big furor. The other is that some of the charges are based on the power that the customer produces and consumes behind the meter. And that's roughly half of the electricity that a typical solar system produces is immediately consumed in the house without ever touching the grid. And so to charge customers for grid-related costs for power that never even touches the grid is also something that there really is not a basis for it in cost causation principles. and it also, I think, causes a lot of controversy because customers don't see why they should be paying for grid costs for the electricity that they produce and consume that never touches the grid.
Thanks for that, Tom. I'm noticing that with that question, we're just about hitting the top of the hour. So I think what I would do here is just perhaps ask just one last time of you, Tom. Is there anything else that you think we should hear that you haven't been able to address through the presentation or questions?
No, I don't think so. I think this, hopefully this has been a good summary of our report. And I think, the questions have gotten to some of the key topics that we addressed. And I'm hopeful that this report can be a resource for you all when you think about this issue going forward.
Fantastic. Tom, thank you very much for the work that you and your colleagues at Crossborder did over the past year working on this. I think it's a really valuable effort. I want to thank specifically the organizations that helped to make this study and this ongoing discussion happen, including in particular, to name a couple, Powder River Basin Resource Council, the Wyoming Outdoor Council, the Wyoming Sierra Club, and there are others beyond that. And I want to thank everybody for participating in this. This is great. We were up to about 70 participants during the call. And though I wasn't able to dig through the list of participants in depth, I want to thank in particular any members of the Public Service Commission or staff members of the Wyoming PSC who joined us, and certainly any state legislators that were here. We thank you very much for participating. It is our hope that this creates a richer conversation about how distributed solar fits into Wyoming's future. Clearly, renewable energy will have an important role in Wyoming's future, and we hope that this study will be useful in helping to shape the best role for distributed scale solar in Wyoming. And with that, I think we can close out.